They called him the King of Kings, the man who built an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. He was merciful, strategic, visionary, almost untouchable. But history hides a question that refuses to die. How did Cyrus the Great, the most powerful ruler of his time, actually fall? Was it betrayal? A brutal battlefield defeat? Or something far more mysterious, rewritten by the victors? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is the dramatic final chapter of a legend. Before we start, subscribe, like, and share if you love true history. And tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? Long before his mysterious death, Cyrus the Great had already become a myth in his own lifetime. Born around 600 BC in the rugged lands of Persia, he inherited a kingdom that was small, fragile, and surrounded by enemies. Yet within a few decades, he would reshape the ancient world. Cyrus understood something most kings didn't. People do not only fear power, they remember justice. Where other conquerors burned cities, Cyrus rebuilt them. Where other rulers enslaved nations, Cyrus allowed them to worship freely, rebuild temples, and govern local affairs. His famous decree, later known as the Cyrus Cylinder, was not just policy, it was a statement to the world. Power could rule without cruelty. And this new style of empire worked. The Medes fell, the Lydians fell, then Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, opened its gates almost without a fight. Instead of slaughtering the people, Cyrus walked in with respect. Priests, nobles, merchants, they all saw something different. A conqueror who didn't destroy but organized. But greatness carries a price. As the empire expanded, Cyrus began to face threats from beyond the familiar world, especially from the fierce tribes of Central Asia, warriors who lived not in cities, but on horseback, hardened by endless war and survival. To Cyrus, they were dangerous, not because of their power, but because of their unpredictability. Among them stood a queen who would soon become central to his fate, Tomyris, ruler of the Massagetæ. Ancient historians describe her as strong, proud, and unafraid of kings. Cyrus, seeing both threat and opportunity, launched a campaign eastward. It was supposed to be another swift victory, another chapter of glory in his empire's expansion. But this campaign would become the most fateful decision of his life. Advisors warned him, the terrain was harsh. Supplies would be stretched thin. The enemy knew the land better than anyone. Yet Cyrus believed something deeply, that destiny favored the bold. And destiny, he thought, had always favored him. His army marched into unfamiliar country, deserts, steppe, endless horizons. Every mile took them farther away from the urban centers of Persia, into land ruled not by stone walls, but by speed, cunning, and ambush. Then came the first clash. Cyrus used a clever trick. He set a lavish camp full of food and wine, pretending to retreat. The Massagetæ attacked, celebrating victory, and Cyrus struck back, capturing many of them, including Tomyris' own son. It seemed brilliant at first, but this victory would ignite a storm. Because while Cyrus believed he had trapped his enemies, he had instead awakened their fury. And now the greatest ruler of the ancient world was walking, step by step, toward the battle that would define his legend and end his story. When Tomyris learned what had happened, the story says the sky itself seemed to darken over the steppes. Her son, captured, her warriors tricked and slaughtered. But this was not a queen who wept in silence. Tomyris sent a message to Cyrus, and it was not a plea, it was a warning. She demanded that he release her son, withdraw from her lands, and end the invasion. She reminded him that he had already taken enough empires, enough cities, enough lives. She accused him not of bravery but of deception, of winning not by honor but by traps and tricks. And for the first time in his life, Cyrus ignored the message that might have saved him. He refused. Inside his camp, some of his generals began to worry. They had marched far, the terrain was unknown, and the enemy was burning everything behind them: food, supplies, water. The army was becoming tired, stretched thin, exposed. Then the news came. Tomyris' son, heartbroken and humiliated by capture, took his own life. For the Massagetæ, that was unforgivable. Tomyris' grief turned to iron. She called her warriors, painted herself for war, and swore an oath. She would not rest until Cyrus was destroyed. Not beaten, not driven away, destroyed. Ancient historians describe this moment like the calm before a storm. Cyrus stood on one side, surrounded by banners, soldiers, and decades of victories. Tomyris stood on the other, with riders who lived and died in battle, who could fire arrows while galloping at full speed, who needed no walls, no fortresses, only open land. This was not just a war. It was two worlds colliding. Empire versus tribe strategy versus instinct, order versus freedom. Cyrus believed discipline would win. Tomyris believed rage and terrain would. The armies clashed, sudden, loud, devastating. Spears shattered, arrows fell like rain. Horses crashed through lines of shields. At first, it seemed Cyrus had the upper hand. His formations held strong. His veterans had fought the Lydians, the Babylonians, and countless others. Step by step, they pushed forward. But then the battlefield changed. The Massagetae did not fight like ordinary soldiers. They scattered, reformed, circled around, struck from both sides, and vanished again. They attacked supply lines, cut messengers, harassed the flanks, and refused to meet Cyrus in the kind of battle he preferred. Hours turned into a nightmare. The Persians were surrounded, exhaustion spread. Confusion grew, orders became harder to hear. Cyrus, the man who always controlled the battle, suddenly found himself reacting instead of commanding. Some accounts claim that in the chaos he was wounded. Others say he refused to retreat, that he chose to stand with his men when escape was still possible. But one thing every story agrees on: the battlefield that day did not belong to Persia. The sun began to set, and with it, the legend of invincibility that had followed Cyrus for decades. And somewhere in the dust, in the screams, in the clash of swords and hooves, the King of Kings fell. Whether he died fighting hand to hand, struck by an arrow, or overwhelmed in the final charge, history remains divided. But the outcome was clear. The greatest conqueror of his age would not return home. And Tomyris was not finished yet, because what she did next would shock the ancient world and echo through history like a warning to every king who believed himself untouchable. When the dust of battle finally settled, the steppe fell strangely silent. No royal trumpets, no victory speeches, no soldiers chanting their king's name, instead, bodies. Thousands of them, Persians and Massagetae alike, scattered across the endless plains. And somewhere among them lay the fallen body of Cyrus the Great. For the Persians, it was unthinkable. This was the man who had conquered kingdoms, freed nations, and built one of the greatest empires in human history. Many soldiers refused to believe it. They searched the battlefield, calling his name, hoping he would rise. Wounded, perhaps, but alive. But he did not rise. The news reached Tomyris. To her, this was not merely victory. It was justice. A justice carved from vengeance, grief, and the oath she had sworn over the death of her son. Ancient writers tell a chilling story. Tomyris ordered Cyrus's body brought before her. She stood over the king who had once commanded half the known world, now motionless, humbled, stripped of power. She looked at the man whose ambition had crossed into her lands, whose trickery had cost her a son. And she spoke words meant for history. "You who have always thirsted for blood, drink your fill." Then, according to legend, she ordered his head cut off and thrown into a basin filled with blood. Was this exactly what happened? We cannot be certain. Some historians say it was symbolic. Others believe enemies of Persia exaggerated the story to humiliate Cyrus's legacy. Perhaps the truth was far simpler, that he was buried with honor by his men, far from the dramatics of legend. But myths rise where facts disappear. And sometimes myths tell us more about fear, anger, and memory than simple facts ever could. What we know for certain is this: Cyrus's death shook the empire to its core. Persian generals scrambled to preserve order. Messengers carried the devastating news across vast distances. In cities from Babylon to Sardis, people whispered in disbelief, "Cyrus is dead." Yet even in death, his story refused to collapse. Because unlike most conquerors, Cyrus had not ruled by terror alone. He had built systems, respected cultures, and earned loyalty. So when he died, the empire did not instantly crumble. Instead, his successors fought to maintain what he had created, sometimes wisely, sometimes disastrously. But for the world beyond Persia, his death carried another message. Even the greatest kings fall. There is something profoundly human in that truth. Cyrus was brilliant, visionary, yet he was also ambitious, perhaps too confident, willing to push further than any army should have gone. His final campaign reminds us that even legends make fatal mistakes. And what of Tomyris? History remembers her not as a villain, but as a sovereign defending her land, stubborn, fierce, unbroken. Her victory was not about glory or conquest. It was about honoring a promise to her people and avenging the life taken from her. 2 leaders, 2 worlds, 1 battlefield that changed both forever. But the story of Cyrus does not end here. Because centuries later, philosophers, rulers, and even modern nations would look back at him not as a defeated king, but as a model of leadership, tolerance, and justice. How did his legacy survive when his body did not? That is the next chapter. Empires usually break when their founders fall. When Alexander died, his generals tore his world apart. When great kings vanish, chaos usually follows like a shadow. But with Cyrus the Great, something different happened. Yes, there was shock, yes, there was fear, but the empire he built did not disappear overnight. Why? Because Cyrus had not simply taken lands, he had built a system. He appointed governors. He respected local customs. He created roads, communication networks, and fair laws. His empire did not depend on one man shouting commands. It depended on ideas. And ideas are harder to kill than kings. His son Cambyses took the throne, continuing the expansion into Egypt. Other rulers followed, including Darius the Great, who organized the empire even more deeply. In many ways, Persia reached its true administrative strength after Cyrus was gone. So while his body lay buried, likely in Pasargadae inside a simple stone tomb still standing today, his vision lived on. Travelers would come from distant lands and stare at that tomb, not covered in gold, not decorated with 1,000 jewels. Just quiet, modest, almost humble. Because Cyrus understood something rare among rulers. Power is temporary. Legacy is not. Across history, nations who heard of Cyrus learned different lessons. To the Greeks, he was both a rival and a model. Xenophon, the Greek historian, wrote Cyropaedia, a book praising Cyrus as the ideal ruler. Wise, disciplined, fair. Generals and philosophers studied it for centuries. To the Jews, Cyrus was the king who allowed them to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He is remembered in the Bible not as a tyrant, but almost as a liberator. To Persians, he became the father of their civilization, not perfect, not divine, but deeply human and deeply respected. And yet, the mystery of his death never faded. Every generation retold it slightly differently. Some said he died in glorious combat, defiant till his last breath. Others said he fell victim to his own ambition, pushing too far into lands he did not understand. Others removed Tomyris completely and replaced her with different enemies. But underneath every version lies one stubborn truth. Cyrus was not immortal. And that makes his story powerful. Because when legends die, we get to see what they truly stood for. Cyrus's empire did not survive forever. Eventually it fell to Alexander, then fractured, then transformed. But even those who conquered Persia respected Cyrus. Alexander himself reportedly visited his tomb, and the story says he stood in silence, honoring the man who ruled not just through fear, but through wisdom. Think about that. One conqueror saluting another, one empire builder recognizing greatness across centuries. Cyrus's death reminds us of something deeper than war. Leadership is not about how loudly you command. It is about how strongly your values remain when you are gone. His tolerance, his policies, his fairness, those became his true monument. Not the battlefield, not the blood, not even the crown, but the idea that power could be used with justice. And yet questions still remain. Questions historians still debate. Did Tomyris really defeat him exactly as the legends say? Was his head truly thrown into a bowl of blood? Or did storytellers magnify everything to make the tale more dramatic? To uncover that, we need to rewind and examine the sources themselves. Who wrote these stories and why? Because sometimes history is not just what happened, it is what people wanted others to believe. To truly understand how Cyrus the Great died, we have to step away from the battlefield and step into the minds of the people who wrote history. Because Cyrus never left us his own account. Everything we know about his final days comes from others, often outsiders, often rivals, sometimes storytellers trying to make a point rather than record reality. One of the most famous ancient historians is Herodotus, the Greek writer often called the father of history. He is the main source who tells the dramatic story of Queen Tomyris, the ambush, the death in battle, and the head in a bowl of blood. But here's the problem. Herodotus was writing decades later. He relied on rumors, oral traditions, and stories that traveled across borders, changing every time they were retold. And Greece had its own reasons to portray Persian kings as reckless, overconfident, and destined to fall. So is Herodotus telling the full truth or telling a dramatic moral lesson? Other sources provide different versions. The historian Ctesias, who actually lived at the Persian court years later, describes another ending entirely. In his account, Cyrus died while fighting a different nomadic tribe, wounded during a campaign but cared for by loyal soldiers before passing away quietly. No queen, no bowl of blood, no dramatic speeches, just a king who pushed too far and paid the price. Then there are Persian traditions themselves. Many Persian accounts avoid the humiliation narrative altogether. They portray Cyrus dying honorably and being buried with respect, focusing not on his defeat, but on his achievements and legacy. So which version is correct? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Most historians today agree on a few likely facts. Cyrus did launch a campaign against nomadic tribes in Central Asia. He did face very tough resistance. He was most likely killed in that campaign, either in battle or from wounds. What changed over time were the details, shaped by culture, politics, and storytelling. For the Greeks, Cyrus's death was a warning against pride. For the Massagetæ, it was a tale of revenge and justice. For the Persians, it was something more sacred, the passing of a founder whose memory should not be stained by humiliation. This raises a bigger question. Why do humans turn deaths into legends? Because legends teach. They tell us, don't be arrogant, don't underestimate your enemy. Even kings must face consequences. The Tomyris story, whether fully true or partly symbolic, carries emotional power because it feels like justice wrapped in tragedy. But behind the legend, there was still a man who planned campaigns, a man who loved victory, a man who misjudged his final enemy and stepped too far beyond the map of safety. In the end, Cyrus's exact death may remain unsolved. But perhaps that mystery is why his story continues to fascinate us. Because uncertainty invites imagination, and imagination keeps legends alive. Yet one last question remains, the most important one. What did Cyrus learn? And what did the world learn from the way he lived and died? That brings us to the final part. Not about his fall, but about what his story still means today. Cyrus the Great may have died on the windswept steppes of Central Asia, but his story did not end there. In fact, his death transformed him into something greater than a man, into a symbol. Across centuries, his life and his passing taught lessons about leadership, justice, and human ambition. The battlefield where he fell became more than a place of death. It became a metaphor for the fine line between glory and overreach. Consider this. Cyrus ruled an empire that stretched farther than any other before him. Yet he maintained fairness, respect, and mercy. He built roads that allowed trade and communication. He honored the religions and traditions of conquered peoples. Even in death, these principles survived. His son Cambyses continued expansion. Darius, later on, organized Persia into a model of administration, showing that what Cyrus had begun was sustainable. His empire became a foundation for civilizations to come, including the world Alexander would later inherit. And yet, what fascinates historians most is the mystery surrounding his final hours. Was he betrayed by the terrain, overconfidence, or by the fierce intelligence of Tomyris? Did the bowl of blood story actually happen? We may never know. But the symbolic power of that narrative matters as much as the facts. It reminds us that even the most powerful rulers are vulnerable, that even kings must answer to fate, enemies, and history itself. Legends often focus on the dramatic, but history looks deeper. Cyrus's legacy survives in governance. His systems influenced Persian and later empires. Tolerance. His respect for culture and religion became an enduring model. Inspiration. From Xenophon's Cyropedia to modern historians, his life is a blueprint for leadership and vision. Tomyris, the queen who refused to bow, also reminds us that the world is not shaped by one man alone. Strength comes in many forms: courage, strategy, loyalty, and the will to protect one's people. And so, the story of Cyrus the Great is not just a story of death. It is a story of immortality through legacy. A king falls, but the empire he envisioned and the values he embodied can outlive even the sharpest swords. The final lesson is haunting and inspiring. Even the mightiest conqueror is mortal. Even the most disciplined army can falter. But honor, vision, and justice, these are the things that truly make a king immortal. So the next time you hear the story of Cyrus the Great, remember, it is not just about how he died, but how he continues to shape the world long after the battlefield fell silent. History whispers his name, legends amplify it, And centuries later, we are still drawn to the enigma of a man who conquered the world, and yet could not conquer death. If you found this documentary powerful, like, subscribe and share. And in the comments below, tell me where you are watching from. Let's see how far Cyrus's legacy still reaches today.